Sometimes the cold doesn't just freeze the water. It preserves the things the world tried to forget. The lake stretched out like a sheet of cracked glass beneath a pale winter sky. Its surface glazed in ice that shimmered faintly under the weak afternoon sun, and the wind moved across it in long, hollow breaths, carrying a sound that was almost, but not quite, silence. The kind of silence that made a man feel like he was standing at the edge of something older than memory itself. And Caleb Turner stood there at the tree-line with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, his shoulders hunched against the bite of the cold, his breath drifting out in slow white clouds that vanished just as quickly as they appeared, as if even the air refused to hold on to anything for long. And beside him stood Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat of dark sable and silver that caught the light in quiet flashes, his ears high, his body still, but his eyes, those sharp amber eyes, were fixed not on the horizon, not on the frozen lake, but somewhere deeper, as if he were listening to something beneath it, something Caleb could not hear. And for a long moment neither of them moved, because out here movement felt like a decision, and decisions had a way of changing things, and Caleb had spent the last few years avoiding anything that might change the fragile balance he had built between staying alive and truly living. But then Shadow let out a low, deliberate bark, not loud, not panicked, just enough to break the stillness like a stone dropped into water, and Caleb's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he followed the direction of the dog's gaze toward the center of the lake, where the ice looked thinner, darker, like a bruise spreading beneath the surface. And then it came. The sound, faint at first, a sharp crack that echoed across the open space, followed by something else, something human, a voice carried weakly by the wind, and Shadow barked again, this time sharper, more urgent, his body already shifting forward, paws pressing into the snow as if pulled by something unseen, and Caleb felt it then, that familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct he had tried to bury since leaving the service, the part of him that still moved toward danger instead of away from it. And before he could stop himself, he was already stepping out from the safety of the trees, boots crunching against the frozen ground as he moved toward the lake, each step measured, each breath steady, while Shadow surged ahead, stopping at the edge of the ice and looking back just once, as if to say this was the moment. This was the line you either crossed or walked away from. And Caleb didn't hesitate, not this time, because somewhere out there, beyond the thin skin of ice and the whispering wind, a life was slipping beneath the surface, and whether he wanted it or not, something in this frozen place had already chosen him to answer it. The first step onto the ice felt like stepping onto something that did not fully belong to the world above, a thin, uncertain surface that answered each movement with a quiet complaint, a low creak that traveled outward in delicate fractures, and Caleb lowered his center of gravity instinctively, spreading his weight the way he had learned years ago in places where the ground could not always be trusted, his boots sliding forward inch by inch as he dropped to one knee, then both, palms pressing flat against the frozen surface as if he were listening through it, as if the lake itself might speak if he got close enough. And behind him Shadow remained at the edge, muscles taut, claws dug into the snow, a living anchor against the pull of something unseen, his breath coming in steady bursts that fogged the air, his eyes locked on Caleb with a focus that held both urgency and trust. And then the sound came again, clearer this time, a sharp splintering crack followed by the unmistakable rush of water breaking through ice, and Caleb's gaze snapped forward to where a dark shape moved beneath a widening fracture, a man's arm breaking through the surface, gloved fingers clawing at the edges as the ice gave way in small, brittle pieces, and for a moment everything seemed to slow, the wind quieting, the world narrowing to that single point where life struggled against the cold, and Caleb exhaled slowly, forcing his mind into the calm rhythm he had carried through worse situations, measuring distance, measuring risk, measuring the fragile line between reaching and falling through. And he began to crawl, each movement deliberate, elbows and knees distributing his weight across the ice, the sound beneath him shifting from solid to hollow with every inch forward, until the cold seeped through his jacket and into his bones. And still he did not stop, because there was something in the way the man moved. Not just panic, but a kind of fading strength, the slow surrender that came when the body could no longer fight the cold. And Caleb knew that timing mattered now more than anything else. That hesitation would cost more than the risk ever could. And behind him, Shadow let out a single sharp bark. Then another, a pattern Caleb recognized not as fear, but as warning of change. As if the dog could sense the moment tipping towards something irreversible, and Caleb reached the edge of the broken ice. Stretching one arm forward, his hand closing around the man's wrist with a grip that was firm but steady, not pulling yet, just holding, grounding, letting the man feel that he was no longer alone, and their eyes met then, just for a second. The stranger's gaze clouded with cold and disbelief. Yet beneath it there was something else, something that did not match the desperation of the moment, something almost like recognition. And Caleb felt it too, a strange flicker of familiarity that made no sense in a place like this, in a moment like this. But there was no time to question it, because the ice groaned beneath them, a deep, shifting sound that reminded him how fragile this entire scene truly was. And he tightened his grip, shifting his weight backward inch by inch, beginning the slow pull towards solid ground, while Shadow leaned into the tension behind him, body braced, every muscle engaged, as if the dog understood that this was not just a rescue, but the beginning of something. Neither of them could yet see, something already moving beneath the surface, waiting to rise. The ice did not break, but it did not feel certain either, and Caleb could sense the tension beneath his body as he shifted his weight backward inch by inch, the frozen surface responding with low, uneasy groans that traveled outward like distant thunder, and the man's arm trembled in his grip, not resisting, not pulling away, just holding on with the quiet desperation of someone who had already come too close to letting go. And Caleb kept his voice low, steady, the way he had learned to speak in moments where panic could tip everything into chaos, telling him to stay with him, to keep his eyes open, to follow the rhythm of his breathing. And the man nodded faintly, though his lips were pale and his gaze flickered between awareness and something deeper, something that felt like memory slipping in and out of reach. And behind them, Shadow adjusted his stance, lowering his body further into the snow, every muscle aligned with Caleb's movement, acting not just as support, but as a living extension of his will. And together they formed a line between danger and safety, between what was falling away and what could still be held. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between the broken ice and the solid edge began to close, each inch earned with patience rather than force, because force would have shattered what little held them together. And when Caleb finally felt the stronger ground beneath his knees, he allowed himself a single breath of relief. Not full, not complete, just enough to mark the shift from survival to something steadier. And with one final pull, he guided the man fully onto the unbroken ice, then across it, dragging both of them toward the shore where the snow waited like a quiet promise. And the moment they crossed that invisible line, Shadow surged forward, circling once before pressing close, his nose brushing against the man's sleeve as if confirming something only he understood. And Caleb eased back, sitting in the snow as the cold seeped through him, his chest rising and falling with a controlled rhythm that masked the exhaustion settling into his bones. And for a while none of them spoke, because some moments carried too much weight for words. And the wind returned, softer now, moving through the trees in a low whisper that felt almost like acknowledgement. And the man lay there, staring up at the sky as if seeing it for the first time, his breath uneven but present, his hand still loosely wrapped around Caleb's sleeve, unwilling to let go entirely. And then, after a long silence, he turned his head slightly, his eyes clearer now, searching Caleb's face with a quiet intensity that did not match the randomness of the accident. And when he spoke, his voice was thin but certain, carrying something deeper than gratitude, something that felt placed rather than spontaneous. He said that he knew someone would come, not because of luck, not because of chance, but because some things were not meant to end beneath the ice. And Caleb frowned slightly, not fully understanding, yet unable to dismiss the weight of those words. And Shadow, who had finally settled beside them, lifted his head once more, ears tilting toward the lake behind them, listening again to that unseen rhythm beneath the frozen surface, as if the rescue had not closed the moment, but opened something that had been waiting far longer than either man could remember. The cold did not leave immediately. It lingered in the air and in their bones, settling into the quiet space that followed something that should not have gone right, but somehow did. And Caleb remained seated in the snow for a moment longer than necessary, not out of weakness, but because he had learned that rushing away from a moment often meant missing what it was trying to say. And beside him, Shadow stayed close. His body no longer tense, but not fully relaxed either, his gaze drifting between the man and the lake as if measuring something that had not yet revealed itself. And the man slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows, each movement careful, deliberate, like someone returning to a body that had nearly forgotten how to respond. And Caleb reached out, steadying him without speaking, because words still felt too small for what had just happened. And together they rose, not quickly, but with the quiet patience of people who understood that balance mattered more than speed. And when the man finally stood, he did not look back at the broken ice the way most would. He looked past it, toward the far edge of the lake where the trees gathered thick and dark, and something in his expression shifted, not fear, not relief, but recognition, as if the place itself held meaning beyond the moment. And Caleb noticed it, the way a soldier notices small changes others might miss. And before he could ask anything, the man reached into his coat with hands that still trembled slightly, pulling out a small object wrapped in worn cloth, holding it carefully, as if it carried weight far greater than its size. And he pressed it into Caleb's hand without hesitation, his grip firm despite the cold. And for a second their eyes met again, and this time the look was clearer, steadier, carrying a quiet certainty that felt out of place in a world built on chance. And he told Caleb that some things are not given as rewards, they are returned when the time is right. And the words settled into the space between them like something meant to stay, not just be heard. And Caleb glanced down at the object, feeling the texture of the cloth, the faint outline of something solid beneath it. But before he could unwrap it, the man gently closed his hand around it, shaking his head slightly, not as a refusal, but as a delay, as if the moment to understand had not yet arrived. And Shadow stepped closer then, lowering his nose to Caleb's hand, sniffing once before lifting his head again toward the lake, ears tilting sharply. And Caleb followed the motion, his gaze returning to the frozen surface where the fracture still marked the place of the fall. And for just a second the light shifted across the ice, revealing something beneath, not movement exactly, but a pattern, a subtle change in color that seemed too precise to be random. And the wind moved again, carrying a low sound across the surface, not quite a voice, not quite silence. And Caleb felt that same quiet pull in his chest, the one he had ignored for too long, the one that told him this was not finished, that whatever had begun out there on the ice had roots that reached deeper than a simple accident. And when he turned back, the man was already stepping away, moving toward the narrow path that led through the trees, his pace slow but steady, not looking back, as if he trusted Caleb would understand when the time came. And Shadow watched him go, not with suspicion, but with something closer to acceptance, as if he recognized a part of the story that had yet to be told. And Caleb remained where he was for a moment longer, the cold pressing in again, the wrapped object resting in his hand, heavier now not because of what it was, but because of what it might mean. And somewhere behind him the lake gave a soft, distant crack, not breaking, just reminding him that some surfaces hold more than they show, and some answers wait beneath until someone is willing to listen. Caleb did not follow the man immediately, not because he did not want to, but because something in the moment asked him to stay, to listen, to let the silence settle before taking the next step. And he stood there at the edge of the lake with the wrapped object resting in his palm, feeling its quiet weight, as if it carried more than just whatever was hidden beneath the cloth. And Shadow remained beside him, still and attentive, his gaze no longer fixed on the departing figure, but drawn back toward the frozen water, where the light had shifted again, faint reflections moving across the surface like something trying to be seen without fully revealing itself. And Caleb exhaled slowly, then finally turned away, following the narrow trail the man had taken, his boots pressing into the snow with a steady rhythm that matched the calm he forced into his thoughts, because questions were beginning to gather, and he knew better than to chase them too quickly. And the trees closed in around them as they moved, tall pines rising on either side, their branches heavy with snow that softened every sound, creating a quiet so complete it felt almost intentional, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And after a few minutes the path opened to a small clearing where a cabin stood, weathered but intact. Its wood darkened by years of wind and winter, and smoke curled faintly from a narrow chimney, thin and steady, a sign of warmth that seemed to exist outside the cold logic of. At the door, as if he had expected Caleb to follow, his posture no longer fragile, but grounded, almost certain, and he stepped inside without a word, leaving the door slightly open, not as an invitation, but as something quieter, something that suggested the choice had already been made. And Caleb paused for a moment before crossing the threshold, not out of hesitation, but because he felt the shift the moment he stepped inside. The air warmer, yes, but also different, carrying a scent of old wood and something faintly metallic, like time itself had settled into the walls, and Shadow entered behind him, moving slowly, his nose low, scanning the floor, the corners, the space beneath the ordinary surface of things, and Caleb closed the door gently, the outside world falling away with a soft click, and for a moment they simply stood there, the fire crackling in a small stone hearth, casting a low amber glow that moved across the room in quiet waves, and the man gestured toward a chair, without speaking, then moved to a small table where a lantern burned with steady light, and Caleb stepped forward, finally unwrapping the cloth in his hand, his fingers careful, deliberate, revealing a small metal key, old but well kept, its surface worn smooth in places as if it had been held many times over many years, and he turned it slightly, watching how the light caught along its edges. And before he could ask the question forming in his mind, the man spoke again, his voice stronger now, steadier, carrying a tone that felt less like explanation and more like memory being handed forward. And he said that some doors are not locked to keep people out, but to make sure the right person is the one who opens them. And Caleb felt that same quiet pull again, deeper this time, as if the answer to something he had not yet asked was waiting just beyond the edge of understanding. And Shadow lifted his head sharply then, ears forward, body still, his attention drawn not to the man, not to the key, but to the far wall of the cabin where the wood panels met in a pattern too precise to be random. And he let out a low, steady sound, not a warning, but a signal, the kind that meant discovery. And Caleb followed his gaze, the key still resting in his hand, its weight now undeniable, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it was meant to unlock. And somewhere beyond the walls, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying a sound that felt almost like a whisper returning after a long silence. Caleb did not move right away, because something about the way Shadow held his stance told him that this was not just another moment. This was a threshold, and thresholds demanded patience. So he stepped closer to the far wall, his boots quiet against the wooden floor, his eyes tracing the seams between the panels where the grain of the wood shifted ever so slightly, just enough to suggest that what appeared solid might not be as simple as it seemed. And the fire behind him crackled softly, its warmth brushing against his back while the rest of the room seemed to hold a cooler stillness, as if this particular section of the cabin existed in its own quiet pocket of time. And Shadow moved first, pressing his nose gently against one of the panels, then stepping back and looking at Caleb with that familiar steady focus, the kind that had guided him through moments where logic alone was not enough. And Caleb raised the key slightly, feeling its weight settle into his palm with a strange sense of inevitability, like something that had always been meant to find its way here. And without overthinking it, he reached forward, running his fingers along the wood until he felt it, a small indentation, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. And as he pressed the key into place, there was a soft, precise click, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to confirm that something hidden had recognized him. And the panel shifted inward slightly, releasing a breath of cooler air that carried with it a faint scent of earth and metal, like a space that had remained closed for a very long time. And Caleb paused again, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment, because opening something is not the same as understanding it. And Shadow stepped closer, his ears forward, his body calm but alert, ready to follow wherever this next path led. And slowly Caleb pushed the panel further, revealing a narrow passage that descended into the ground, its steps worn but intact, leading into a dimness that seemed less like darkness and more like something waiting. And behind him the man spoke once more, his voice quiet but steady, carrying a tone that felt almost like relief. And he said that some stories are not written in books, they are built into the places people forget to look. And Caleb did not turn to respond, because he could feel that whatever explanation existed would come in its own time, not before. And he stepped forward, one foot onto the first step, then the next, his movements measured, his breathing steady, while Shadow followed close at his side, the soft sound of his paws against the wood echoing gently in the enclosed space. And as they descended, the light from above faded, replaced by a faint glow further down, not bright, but enough to guide without revealing too much. And Caleb's hand brushed the wall as he moved, feeling the cool, solid texture beneath his fingertips, grounding himself in the reality of the space even as the air seemed to shift with every step. And when they reached the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber, simple but deliberate, its walls lined with shelves that held objects arranged with care, old tools, small boxes, items that spoke of time and purpose rather than value alone. And at the center stood a single wooden table, worn smooth by years of use, and on it rested something that caught the light differently than everything else, a small metal box, not ornate, not large, but placed with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. And Caleb felt the quiet pull again, stronger now, guiding him forward not with urgency, but with certainty. And Shadow stopped beside him, sitting calmly, his attention fixed on the box as if he already understood what it meant. And Caleb reached out slowly, the key still in his hand, its purpose not yet fully complete. And in that moment he realized that this was never about what he had saved on the lake, but about what had been waiting for him long before he ever arrived. Something patient, something unseen, something that had chosen this moment to finally be found. Caleb did not rush the final steps, because something in the stillness of the chamber asked for a slower kind of attention, the kind that listens before it acts. And he stood there for a moment with the key resting in his hand, his eyes fixed on the small metal box at the center of the table, noticing how the faint light in the room seemed to gather around it, not brighter, but steadier, as if the object itself held a quiet gravity that shaped the space around it. And Shadow remained seated beside him, calm and watchful, his presence no longer tense but deeply aware, like a companion who had followed a trail long enough to recognize its end. And Caleb stepped forward, each movement measured, his boots making only the softest sound against the worn floor, until he reached the table and placed his free hand on its surface, feeling the smoothness carved by time and use, grounding himself in something real before reaching for what waited. And when he finally lifted the box, it was lighter than he expected, yet it carried a different kind of weight, something less physical and more deliberate, as if what mattered was not the object itself but what it represented. And he turned it slightly in his hands, noticing the small keyhole set into its front, perfectly aligned with the key he had been given. And for a brief second he hesitated, not out of doubt, but because he understood that opening it would change something, not just in the room, but in himself. And he took a slow breath before guiding the key into the lock, the metal sliding into place with a precision that felt almost inevitable. And when he turned it, there was a soft click, followed by a subtle shift in the air, like a held breath being released after a long wait. And the lid opened without resistance, revealing not gold, not stacks of money, but a collection of simple things arranged with care, a folded letter, a small leather-bound journal, and beneath them a photograph faded at the edges, its surface worn but still clear enough to show the outlines of a younger man standing beside a German shepherd, both of them facing the camera with the quiet steadiness of those who had seen more than they spoke about. And Caleb felt something tighten in his chest as he reached for the photograph, his fingers brushing over the image as recognition stirred in a way he could not fully explain, because the man in the picture bore a resemblance to the one he had pulled from the ice, not identical, but close enough to suggest a connection that stretched across time rather than chance. And Shadow leaned forward slightly, his nose hovering just above the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on the image with a calm intensity that suggested he too sensed the importance of what lay there. And Caleb set the photograph down carefully before unfolding the letter, the paper fragile but intact, its handwriting steady and deliberate. And as he began to read the first lines, he felt the quiet certainty settle deeper within him. Because the words did not speak to a stranger, they spoke to someone who would one day arrive. Someone who would answer a call without knowing why. Someone who would carry both the weight and the kindness required to uncover what had been hidden. And Caleb realized then that this was never random, that the rescue, the lake, the man, the key, all of it had been part of something set into motion long before he ever stepped into that frozen clearing. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was drifting through life without direction, because standing there in that quiet chamber, with Shadow beside him and the past unfolding in his hands, he understood that some paths do not begin when you choose them. They begin when they choose you. Caleb read the letter slowly, not because the words were difficult to understand, but because each line seemed to carry a weight that demanded to be felt rather than rushed, and the handwriting, though steady, held the quiet tremor of someone who had written not for the present, but for a moment far in the future, and it spoke of a man who had once stood where Caleb now stood, a man who had also walked away from something he could not fully leave behind, carrying memories that did not fade and a silence that did not break, and beside him in those years had been a dog, loyal and watchful, trained to sense what others could not, a companion not just in survival, but in understanding. And Caleb's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper as he felt the echo of something familiar, not in the details, but in the feeling itself, the quiet bond between a man and an animal who had seen the same world from different eyes. And the letter continued, explaining that the cabin had been built not just as shelter, but as a place to keep something safe until the right person arrived. Someone who would not be drawn by greed or curiosity, but by an instinct to help, even when there was nothing to gain. And Caleb paused there, his gaze drifting briefly toward Shadow, who remained still and attentive, as if he understood every word without needing to hear it. And the letter described how the key had been passed down, not openly, but through moments like the one on the lake, moments where choice revealed character, and how the man Caleb had saved was not the original keeper, but the last in a quiet line of guardians who had waited for the chain to reach its end. And Caleb felt a slow realization settle in, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, like a truth that had been approaching from a distance for a long time. And when he reached the final lines, the message shifted, no longer explaining, but offering something closer to a decision, telling him that what remained in that place was not meant to be hidden forever, but neither was it meant to be revealed without care, that it was now his responsibility to decide what should be done with it. Not based on fear or obligation, but on the same quiet instinct that had led him onto the ice without hesitation. And Caleb lowered the letter slowly, his mind not racing, but deepening, as if the space inside him had expanded to hold something larger than before. And he reached for the journal next, opening it to find pages filled with entries that spanned years, notes about the land, about the lake, about people who had come and gone, each written with the same careful attention, as if even the smallest moments mattered when seen from the right perspective. And among those pages he noticed references to something beneath the lake, not explained directly, but hinted at in fragments, patterns, repeated observations that suggested the place itself held more than its surface revealed. And Shadow shifted slightly then, rising to his feet and turning toward the passage they had descended, his ears tilting as if he were once again listening to that faint, distant rhythm that seemed to move through everything connected to this place. And Caleb followed his gaze, the pieces beginning to align not as answers, but as direction. And he understood that the rescue had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of a responsibility, one that could not be ignored now that it had found him. And for the first time since he had left the world he once knew behind, he did not feel like he was searching for something to hold on to, because something had already found him and placed itself firmly in his hands, waiting not for him to question it, but to decide what kind of man he would be in the presence of it. Caleb closed the journal slowly, his fingers resting on its worn cover as if he could still feel the echo of every word written inside. And for a long moment he did not move, because some realizations do not demand action, they ask for stillness. And Shadow stood beside him, no longer searching, no longer alert in the way he had been before, but settled in a quiet awareness that felt complete. as if whatever path they had been following had finally led to where it was meant to end, or perhaps where it was meant to begin. And Caleb looked once more at the photograph, at the man and the dog who had come before him. And he understood now that what had been passed down was not just a place or a secret, but a trust, something that had been carried carefully through time until it reached someone who would not misuse it, someone who would not turn it into something it was never meant to be, and he felt no rush to claim it, no urge to change anything immediately, only a quiet certainty that he would remain, that he would listen, that he would learn what this place had to offer before deciding what it should become. And he placed the photograph and the letter back into the box with the same care they had been kept, closing the lid gently, not locking it, because it no longer needed to be hidden. And when he turned toward the passage, the light from above seemed different, warmer, not brighter, but more welcoming, as if the space itself had accepted him. And he climbed the steps slowly with Shadow at his side, each step carrying him back toward the surface, back toward the cabin. And when he stepped through the hidden panel and into the main room, the fire was still burning, steady and calm, and the chair where the man had sat was now empty, not abandoned, but simply no longer occupied, as if his role in the story had been completed the moment Caleb had opened the box. And there was no sign of where he had gone, no sound of the door, no trace in the snow beyond what time and wind would soon erase. And Caleb did not search for him, because he understood that some people arrive only to guide a moment, and then leave once it has been fulfilled. And he walked to the window, looking out toward the lake where the ice now lay still and unbroken once more, the fracture no longer visible from this distance, the surface calm, almost peaceful, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. And yet he knew better. He knew that beneath that surface something remained, something patient and enduring, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And Shadow moved beside him, sitting quietly, his gaze following Caleb's out across the frozen water. And for the first time since they had arrived, he did not tilt his ears toward hidden sounds. He did not signal warning or discovery.